Shabbat is a time for enjoyment, and cocktails are a really enjoyable way for enjoying one's Shabbat experience. However, there are a lot of details, parameters, limitations on what one can do for making cocktails. So how do you go about navigating that? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore on the 114th episode of The Jewish Drinking Show, bringing L'chaim to life. With cocktails being such a wonderful piece of providing enjoyment, oneg to one's Shabbat experience, and a lot of intricacies relating to cocktail making, yet not a lot of people know a lot of the intricacies, the various constrictions, restrictions, and also workarounds. I'm very excited to welcome second-time guest to the show, Dan Rabinowitz, for us to work through some of these issues. So Dan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you. It's good to be back.
Absolutely. So for those less familiar with Dan here, he is many things. He is the Chief Executive Officer of DEKō Cocktails. And if you haven't checked out that episode, number 105 of the Jewish Drink Show, you can feel free to check that out to find out more about those pre-made, ready-to-drink cocktails, which are certified by the Start K. He is many other things. But one thing I did not share with the last recording, and I only found out following that recording, he is also the Dan Rabinowitz. Of course, there are many Dan Rabinowitzes, but the Dan Rabinowitz of the Seforim Blog. So I'm very excited, and for fans of the Seforim Blog, this is Dan. So, and you're a lawyer also, correct?
Yes, I am an attorney as well. Yes.
Awesome. And you do something legal pre-Dicta?
Yes, I have a company that profiles federal judges in order to determine how they will rule.
Awesome. All right. Fantastic. Okay, so let's get into the conversation. Cocktails on Shabbat. So I think, I mean, I don't think anybody disagrees that cocktails on Shabbat are something that just should not happen, right? I think, and you are welcome to disagree with me, but cocktails are a wonderful fulfillment of the value of oneg Shabbat, of enjoyment of Shabbat, right, Dan?
Yeah, I mean, alcohol certainly plays a significant role in that. I mean, that's why you're allowed to use hard alcohol. Hard alcohol, essentially, or distilled spirits, in many ways, is similar to a cocktail. I mean, it's made from multiple ingredients, unlike wine, right? Mm-hmm. So, Scotch, if you will, is a pre-made cocktail, right? In a way.
I mean, in an exceedingly loose definition of cocktail. Actually, this really brings up a really fascinating point. I think when it comes to Shabbat imbibing, people, of course, wine is the mainstay. It is the foundational, certainly, object of Kiddush, going back to early rabbinic Tannaitic times. But there's also, I think, pretty commonly Scotch or other whiskeys, and people thinking about imbibing on Shabbat, it's those beverages. But cocktails, I don't think people typically think about cocktails when it comes to Shabbat, right?
Yeah, well, it's not all that surprising. I mean, the cocktail movement really only began in the late 19th, early 20th century. Mainly in the United States and Western Europe, certainly did not infiltrate Eastern European Jewry, where the vast majority of Jews were, and as a consequence, they were most familiar with distilled spirits. Now, in the United States, it was very different at that time, and in fact, it's really interesting to think about because cocktails may or may not have been considered the common drink, depending, of course, on Prohibition and the Volstead Act. At the same time, there certainly was a rise up until Prohibition, and then, of course, it fell off after that. But then there's been a revival since the early 2000s. And that's really what we're seeing now. So if you think about even, in the latter part of the 21st century, I mean, at the end of the 90s and so on, they started to have these very disgusting sort of, which they've now brought back into some form or another, like coffee martini cocktails and all these variations, Appletini and so on, and Cosmos. So that was sort of the very, very beginning. So it's really unsurprising, though, that we don't see, or it isn't immediately associated with Kiddush in the morning. Now, at the same time, if you went back 15 years, tequila wouldn't either be associated with Shabbos morning. But my sense today is that is fairly prevalent among many as the drink choice.
I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I wanted to break in and give you a sneak peek into next week's episode on Provençal medieval rabbis on wine.
I don't know whether they did it in practice, but they quoted the Rambam and they didn't have any problem with it. But because these people in Spain who were influenced indirectly by Shlomo Minahar, they were opposed to it. So it kind of disappeared off the books, and I'm not aware of anybody today who considers that a viable opinion.
I hope you enjoy that sneak peek into, it's not next week's episode, it's actually the next episode. That 115th episode will be coming out in about a month from now, on October 25th, as we take a break for the holidays. So I hope you have a wonderful set of holidays. Now back into this show.
A well-made cocktail typically has fresh ingredients. It's well executed, which typically means it's measured almost exactly. It's shaken for a period of time, and then or stirred, depending on the particular type. And then, of course, it's strained appropriate into an appropriate glass. So each of those, if you will, has or presents potential pitfalls as it relates to Shabbos. So if you just begin with fresh ingredients, so as it relates to Shabbos, of course, squeezing generally is prohibited.
Actually, before we get to squeezing, can we talk about measuring for a moment, which you just mentioned? So the issue of medida, of measuring, is an issue, yes, but there's an easy workaround for measuring, right?
Yeah, the Rama says, or he offers a solution that he actually says it's the minhag pashut. In other words, that's the widespread custom, and that is to not do it exact. And frankly, with a jigger, it's really nice. Depending on the type of jigger you have, it actually won't make that much of a difference. So, Japanese jiggers, which are tall, right? They're like tall and narrow. So the benefit of the tall and narrow is that even if you are short, it doesn't have nearly as a significant effect if they're much wider and fatter, right? There's greater surface area. So just shorting it a little bit here probably won't make that much of a difference, but at the same time would conform with the Ramah. So you could still do pretty close to exact and still get where I think that you need to get to. For that. So,
can I? So guesstimating is fine. It can be rough. It doesn't have to be, as long as we're not being super precise, right? That's the easy workaround.
Yes.
Yeah. Although I will share with the listeners. So in doing a little research before this episode, apparently there is a type of measuring that is permitted according to halacha, at least according to Mishnah Berurah, for those looking to keep score at home. It's in 306:36, but one can measure the amount for kiddush. That is a measuring that is permissible, which I was fascinated to come across.
As it relates to Yom Tov, there's absolutely no prohibition because as it relates to Yom Tov, when it comes to spices, which are understood as things that even a small difference can matter in the end, you're allowed to measure specifically with actual measurements and so on, distinct from other sorts of food measurements. So on Yom Tov, you can go absolutely, precise.
Hey there, I wanted to see how you're enjoying the episode so far. If you have any feedback, comments, questions, anything, please let me know. And also, if you have topics as well as potential guests, including, who knows, maybe yourself, please let me know. Feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. Thank you, and now back into the show.
Well, juicing is interesting because although people assume juicing to be prohibited, lemons actually are in a special category. Right?
I was shocked. I mean, I think one would just assume one would assume juicing is just outright prohibited, but the Shulchan Aruch outright permits it. He says, "Oh, lemons? Yeah, you can juice them." I was shocked to hear that
because you don't drink the juice just by itself, so it's not a problem to go ahead and juice it. So yes,
which is a great leniency for making cocktails on Shabbat.
Cocktails. Correct. So you'd be able to do that. So the only juices, of course, that you couldn't do that with would be orange juices, right? So that probably wouldn't fall under, although it depends. Some understand that it's limited to the two cases that the Gemara mentions, which is olives and grapes. But maybe oranges might be different. But yes, so according to that, no problem. Easiest way to juice is, you can, if you don't have access to a juicer always, you can use a fork. Right? Have you ever seen this? Take out the thing, you stab it with a fork, move the fork around, and it juices the whole thing. It's very easy.
Wow.
It doesn't require anything. You sort of cut the citrus in half, so you have half the citrus. Take the fork, and you almost use the fork, to move it around, and that's you can this thing to sort of squeeze it.
You're saying for Shabbat to use the fork?
Yeah. So it depends on how you define forks and knives, whether it's considered a
kli,
all right, and whether or not it's an extension of the hand. A lot of people understand like the utensils not to be a kli as it relates to that, but yes, there are certainly those that would prohibit it. Now, even if lemons, we should point out that there's another workaround, even if you hold that lemons are the same as everything else. In other words, that they're equally prohibited as oranges or the simple workaround, of course, is that you are allowed to squeeze even those fruits so long as you squeeze them into another food. So if you would, I see no reason that you couldn't necessarily, for example, take a little piece of apple and put it in a bowl, and then you start squeezing the lemon over it. And then, when you're done, you have lemon juice and take the apple out. So that would, I think, technically be fine. Now, I would suggest.
But the best option is to do it by hand rather than using a utensil, correct?
Squeeze it. Utensil, correct. Although I'm not sure. This is what I admittedly couldn't run down beforehand. Could you actually use a squeezer? There is an idea of like go to the hole, but I don't know necessarily that it would apply if you hold that there's no issue with lemons. Anyways, I think that requires further investigation exactly how you would go about doing that.
Yeah. So you said on food, does that include beverages as well?
I think so.
Yeah, I think so too. So I mean, one thing I did come across, of course, I did mention the Shulchan Aruch. That's for those keeping score at home. It's an Orach Chaim 320, number 6. But Mishnah Berurah specifies in 320:22 that as it just can't be an empty vessel. So I guess that would be an issue if you're measuring or just even guesstimating, right? But that would be a problem to do in an empty vessel. But like you were saying, if it were to go into a liquid or to pre-existing food, that's fine. Yeah.
And the Aruch HaShulchan says explicitly he holds that lemons are totally okay. It's not just the Shulchan Aruch. The Aruch HaShulchan also holds that lemons are fine.
Go Rabbi Epstein.
But I should mention, although it is, I think, imperative that cocktails have fresh ingredients, and certainly anything, you should never, ever, ever use any food that has to be labeled real, like real lemon juice. Right? Anything that you have to append to say real, it's not. So typically anything from a bottle I would not recommend. There is one exception. There is a great company. I have no connection, one way or another with them. They're called Twisted Alchemy. They produce cold pressed juices, which they ship cold. And they can actually last in the bottle. They're not quite as bright as like a absolutely freshly squeezed, but certainly it does a great job. And as I said, they're shipped cold. They're generally very good. They have lime, lemon, and they also have some interesting ones like watermelon and some others that are a little bit harder to come by. But they come in 750 bottles, just like this.
Wow.
And it's actually really well done. They're specifically made for cocktails. In other words, it isn't a juice company. It's a cocktail juice company that they're focused on that. So that just makes the whole thing easy on Shabbos. That's generally what I do because I also have friends over and it's a pain to squeeze or press or whatever, a lot of lemon. So it's just easier to do when a bottle. So I admit cutting corners a little bit there.
No, especially for Shabbat. And like you were saying, if you're having friends over for Shabbat, for Shabbat cocktails, it's an excellent opportunity for that scale.
Yeah. So that's certainly, yeah. So that's, I guess, so we've taken care of two, right? So we have juicing and measuring, right? But now we have to get to, if you will, the next piece is,
wait, I just want to go back. So just because we have a workaround for lemons, and can we throw limes into that category?
Yes. Same one.
Right. But I guess for other fruits that would present a greater issue then.
Right. Such as oranges, if you did oranges.
Yeah.
Oranges might be a problem. But then again, you just, do it into something else, on something else. And that satisfies it. I mean, they just to be clear, like I think it's the Shulchan Aruch or some of the Rishonim talk about like specifically spraying the lemon on sugar,
which could be very interesting for simple syrup stuff.
Yes, but there are easier ways to make simple syrup,
such as.
So obviously, simple syrup is one of the most common modifiers in cocktails, right? Just simple syrup, as the name implies, it's simply, no pun intended, water and sugar, and the sugar is dissolved in the water. There are there's two types generally. There's regular simple syrup, as people refer to, and then rich simple syrup, which is typically 2-to-1. So you'll have rather than a 1-to-1 ratio that you'll have for the sugar and the water, you have a 2-to-1. So it's 2 parts sugar, 1 part water. It creates a thicker mouthfeel, less, but sometimes cocktails call for that. So that is the two general types of syrup that you have. Now, the traditional or the most common way to make it is you put sugar and water in a pot, and you put it on the stove, and you heat it until it dissolves. So first of all, I should just mention, as it relates to measuring, when you make simple syrup, it's certainly better if you use a scale, because, as I'll talk about in a moment, the volume, in other words, a cup of sugar, changes radically depending on the size of the little pieces are. If you have 1 cup of sugar, that could actually mean something very different. So if you weigh it, it's just much easier. So you do, like, whatever, 200 ml of water to 200 grams of sugar, and then you have it. It also makes it easier. You don't have to use any measuring cups, but fine. So you go ahead and measure that out. You heat it on the stove. So now, obviously, Shabbos, you can't go ahead and heat that on the stove. So there are a couple different workarounds here. So the easiest workaround, I would say, is to not get regular sugar, but to get something called superfine or castor sugar. Amazon sells it. Other people sell it. It's very, very fine sugar. And the beauty is because it's so fine, it dissolves in even cold water.
Oh, wow.
So I would suggest you get like a mason jar, which has markings so you can measure, if you will. You fill up to whatever you want. You add the water, put the cap on, shake it for a little bit, and then you have simple syrup. In fact, in many ways, I prefer to make it that way, because when you heat it, sometimes it changes a little bit of the flavor of the sugars. So I generally try to do it on a lower temperature. And what I generally do, and this is what I find to be the easiest to do for all, especially if you're just doing it on a scale, and it's very easy, is to simply pour hot water over the sugar and shake it, and that melts it. That way you never have to heat it. And that, of course, you would be able to do on Shabbos. And here's the way that you would have to flip it, though. So first of all, you cannot pour hot water that's directly on the fire onto sugar and melt it. It's a problem. Now, you can do it if it's too removed, so it's a cliché, right? If you put it into the second thing. Now, of course, the problem with the cliché is it doesn't get quite as hot because it's one removed from the thing. So using a cocktail trick, you can mitigate that. So when you make cocktails, one of the things that's also very important is temperature. So you shake it or stir it in order to reach an optimal temperature, but then you pour it into a glass. So now, if the glass isn't that temperature, it sucks out some of that coldness, or it raises the temperature, and therefore changes the flavor of the cocktail. So depending on what you do, you typically chill the glasses either in a freezer beforehand, or you add ice, and this way your glasses are chilled beforehand. So the same principle would apply on the flip side. That is, what the problem with the cliché is that it's cold. So therefore, when the hot water goes in, it doesn't get as hot. So what I do is I preheat the cliché. First, fill the cliché with hot water. You let it sit for a little bit. You dump that out, and now you can go ahead and use the cliché and get as much benefit as you possibly can. As long as it isn't too hot to cook, then it's not considered a kli rishon, even though the thing. So that's a way to get at least hotter water. So even if you don't have castor sugar, you can still pretty much get it melted, especially if you're willing to just throw it in a mason jar and shake a little bit and just let it sit, and it'll dissolve itself. Now, even easier than that for syrups on Shabbos, in terms of dissolving, is not a sugar-based syrup, but a honey-based syrup. So honey syrup is typically sort of the same ratio. It's not quite, but typically it's referred to as like a 1-to-1. Again, 1 part water to 1 part honey. But it's probably more, I would say it's probably like 2/3 honey, 1/3 water is really what you want. But that, again, provides some sort of syrup, even if you don't have simple syrup. The other alternative, finally, would be agave, which doesn't even have to be diluted. You have to play with the sugars there because it's a little bit different in terms of sweetness. It might not align with the original recipe, but that would be the other way to do that. Now, if you want to then go beyond that and say, well, simple syrup is simple, but you can also make it a little bit more complex. So for example, like now it's a great season to do this, like fresh basil. So you want to make a basil simple syrup. So how do you make basil simple syrup? So you heat the water, you throw some basil in, you let it steep, you strain out the basil, and now you have basil simple syrup. It's wonderful. It's absolutely amazing.
This is, by the way, this is not on Shabbat.
This is not on Shabbat. But how do you do it on Shabbat? So now here's a workaround even for that on Shabbat.
Okay.
So there's an amazing invention.
I was getting this could be a nice transition to the to straining.
To straining, so we'll get there. So there's an amazing invention. So it's a whipper. So if you ever go to like a coffee shop, they have the whippers. So that's all it is. But the beauty of a cream whipper is that it charges. It has a cartridge, and it has the cream, whatever charge thing, and it charges into the canister. So if you fill this with simple syrup and you throw in a bunch of basil and you charge it, and then you bleed off the air, then what you get is basil simple syrup. It infuses the syrup. Now you can do the same thing with alcohol. So if you didn't want to infuse the syrup, you could do it. So there is a terrific drink that's it's turmeric infused gin. So the way that you infuse the gin with turmeric is you just fill this with gin, fresh turmeric, and then you charge it, and then it gets this beautiful yellow color. So this would be a way to infuse. Generally, in other words, forget about cocktails. It's a way to infuse flavor on Shabbos, which doesn't involve heat, right? Right. I mean, it's really a workaround, right? Because really, heat is the way that you would introduce flavor from one or transfer flavor from one. So this is actually a terrific workaround. The same thing also has the ability to use both cream chargers as well as CO2 chargers. So if you want to carbonate a drink, cocktail, you put the cocktail in, you charge it, and then you can dispense it. And it's carbonated just like the soda stream, but you don't have the problem of putting, cocktails in your soda stream. So this makes it much easier, and you could do the infused syrups on it. It's great, especially for like cinnamon, stuff like that. It gets a really clean flavor from it.
Ooh,
yeah.
Wow, that is really cool. But now, can I segue to straining?
Please.
Great. So straining is apparently for, again, those keeping score at home, it's an issue of mishamer. But of course, as we all know, we should try to avoid straining on Shabbat. But there are certain ways that it can be, right? There's some ways that are problematic and some ways that might be surprisingly permissible. So actually, I didn't even know that there would be any permissible way. But perhaps, and I don't know what you found in your research, Dan, but ice cubes? Apparently straining ice cubes might be okay.
Right. So you first have to define, let's sort of take a step back. What are you straining? Let's first decide what you're straining, right?
Yes.
So what are you straining? So you put the various liquids into a shaker, a tin, you throw some ice in, you shake, and then you strain it out. And typically there are two types of strainers, but I'm familiar with the wire one. This one, it has the wire. Part of the reason for the wire is actually to catch things. And depending on what it is, it'll have what's called a guard, which is you can push it up and down, allowing more or less of the other stuff out, whether it be ice or anything else. So if it's lemons, right, so then everything is fine, right? There's no, you just have the juice. The bigger issue, or the thing that for the most part that you're absolutely straining, is the ice, right? So what you're doing when you're doing that, you're really holding back the ice, right? If you didn't have the strainer, what would happen is the ice would dump into your glass. The whole point is to separate. At this point in time, you added the ice, you shook it, and now you want to separate the ice from the cocktail and put the cocktail in the glass. That's what you're doing. So you're separating the ice. Now, as you mentioned, separating ice from water or a liquid is not considered separating. Ice is a liquid. I mean,
right.
Really.
Right. So apparently it really just, it ultimately boils down. That's not the right word, but I'm just going to say boils down. Boils down to, is what one is straining out fit to be drunk? Is it fit to be consumed or not? If you're really trying to hold back something that is just unfit for consumption, that's the most problematic, and something that may or may not be, it could be. But ice is something we drink all the time in our beverages. And so keeping that out apparently is fine.
Yes, and in fact, that's why I think it's even fine. Not only I think, and again, you have to. There might be a reason not to because of the whole, but there's certainly I think is what's rely on. Not only to strain, most of the time when I'm doing a shaken cocktail, I double strain because the small ice chips still come through this strainer. So you double strain it through a fine mesh strainer as well, and that will get all the ice chips.
Wow.
So, there are two thoughts. So, I forget the guy's name now.
Wait, can I just, for those keeping score at home, I'm basing myself off of Mishnah Berurah 319:34, working off of Shulchan Aruch 319:10. Again, those keeping score at home. So, sorry.
Yeah. No. So I was just going to say some bartenders prefer to have the layer of ice on the top, the fine layer of ice, and others prefer it to be clean. There's a Japanese bartender, and I don't remember his name now, but he specifically he deliberately layers the ice on top of the cocktail, like those little sharp he always wants that. But if you don't want that, so then you use the fine mesh strainer, and again, you would just be removing the ice from the drink. But this alone actually doesn't do it.
Wow. Although I think what you were saying, it does matter what you're straining out, because I think more commonly, I mean, look, ice, I think is pretty prevalent as something we strain, but it could be other things like lemon seeds, right? That would be a problem. Or maybe
right. So that's why this doesn't have any seeds in
it. Right. But so straining out lemon seeds would be an issue, right? Because that's not
right. So the way that you get around that, just a thing generally, or get around it, it's just good to know it's a kitchen hack. So when you squeeze a lemon with your hand, okay, don't squeeze it with the lemon out like this. Instead, round the bottom of the cup part of the lemon is in your hand. You squeeze it. What happens is the seeds drop into your palm, and then all the liquid goes away.
That's brilliant.
That's an easy way to at least avoid most of it. It's not going to be perfect, but it does a decent job.
Wow. I mean, if you're not using a utensil, a kli, I mean, might as well use your hands. So that, yeah.
Right.
I imagine most straining is going to be a problem, but if one is straining out only ice, then that would be okay.
And assuming that you don't have seeds or anything, then it really just is ice.
Yeah.
That's perfect. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sometimes I guess the one time that you might have it is if you're muddling herbs or something else. So then you would be also keeping that back, I guess.
In straining, which is a fantastic segue to muddling. So muddling is interesting. If one is, I think there's different routes we can go with muddling. I think people talk about muddling mint is very common. It could be are there other herbs? I mean,
I have a terrific drink that I have a good friend it's her favorite drink, and that is it's in the summer. It's wonderful. It's you muddle arugula.
Ooh,
really,
nice.
really good. It's gin, arugula, simple, lime juice. I think that's it.
Wow.
Yeah.
So okay. So let me start off this way, which is if we're talking about muddling. It's apparently there is a distinction. Shabbat would be problematic, but Yontif, it's actually fine. So as we head into this Yontif season, or really any Yontif, if you're going to muddle, it's fine for Yontif, but Shabbat would be a problem. However, I don't know that all muddling is the same. So this year, and when it was a Derby weekend, so in May, we're talking. So I wanted to do, something very urban-y. What?
A mint julep, yeah.
That's right. I was like, got to do mint julep. I had a bunch of mint growing, grabbed it, and this was during the week, and I muddled it, but I just apparently tore them up. It was just too much. And then I learned that for mint juleps, you actually have to do it very lightly. You just want some aroma expressed. So for something like that, instead of really muddling it, maybe just taking a back of a spoon and just lightly pressing upon it, just so it can just open up, but not really trying to grind it. Right.
So what you're actually trying to do is you're never supposed to be grinding it. It is not intended to grind it.
I learned my lesson in May.
And really what you're doing is really expressing the oils that are in the herb or whatever it is, or the other liquid that might be there. So you're really not looking to tear the leaves at all. You're really looking, in best case, you don't really care to break that up. In other words, the way that the flavor is getting into the drink is not by the little pieces of mint. It's by pushing out the mint oils and whatever else that you're pushing out by pressing on it. So you could do that. Now the issue is that you typically can't just take herbs, right, and grind them. Now the real way that I find most effective generally is not that you just take the herbs and then you muddle them. I find that I generally fill the tin with whatever the citrus and the modifier is, and then you muddle it into that. So you're really sort of just pressing on it in the larger context. So I don't know if that solves the problem, but certainly you should never be pressing on it very, very,
and that's any day of the week.
Any day of the week.
I learned my lesson in May. But even if one were to consider this to be actual grinding, it's okay in Yontif no matter what. Shabbat is really the issue. Not that we're What?
So you could avoid it entirely because, again, because you're not trying to rip it up now, right? So you understand you're not you're just trying to press it. Even if you wouldn't muddle it, if you put it in the tin and you shake it, it's gonna still get some of that, right?
And
it's not going to be quite the same, but you don't even have to.
Right. And another workaround, which I also learned in May, it doesn't even have anything to do with Shabbat, but especially if one is trying to make a mint julep, you just take the mint leaves and just slap them around in your palm of your hand.
So slapping them around in the palm of your hand is when they put I forget what they call it, the plumage or whatever. There's a fancy word for it. But basically, they take the big bouquet of mint and they put it there. When they put it against their hand, that's to release the oils again. So they're sort of activating. It's just when you put your nose in, you're going to get the smell. Then, if you wanted to have the mint flavor in it, I don't like actually muddling mint because it creates pieces, even if you have a strainer. So I either make a mint syrup or, again, like a mint infusion in the alcohol. Generally, I don't like the herbs because, again, even if you're careful, it still breaks it up, and it's terrible to have like a tiny piece of herb in there. So
I will say, even if they're not tiny pieces, even if it's all together, doing that actually made it bitter. That's what I learned my lesson.
And the other thing that you could do to make simple syrup with any of the herbs is you could do it in a high-speed blender. So you just dump the stuff in, you blend the herb in it, and then strain it out, and that will also infuse the syrup with the flavor.
And so you'll have that ready on Friday afternoon.
Exactly. It's all ready to go. You don't have to muddle. You have your mint syrup, you have your basil syrup, or whatever it is. You don't have to do any muddling, and then you're okay.
Although, I mean, for those who do want really fresh mint, you could. I liked your suggestion of just throwing it in the mixer, or not when you're like shaking it, it'll get bounced around, as it were.
Yeah, but truthfully, it really depends what you're looking for. So if you're looking for the aroma, then muddling is unnecessary. What you really want to do is put it in the finished cocktail. Have it in the cocktails this way. When your nose, when you go to drink it, your nose gets the aroma, and that's really what you want for a mint julep. Although I hate them because I find that they're totally not balanced and they're way too boozy. But one of the great things about it is actually the way that it's served. It's served in those silver glasses, which doesn't really matter, but it's served with a straw and crushed ice, and then typically has a very, very large bouquet of mint. And anything with a straw and herbs is awesome because when you suck it on the straw, you're also automatically pulling through your nose.
Oh wow!
So you always get it. It's like if you ever really want, just put a straw in that, and you get all the aroma every time.
Wow! I mean, it is sweet bourbon with some mint.
Yeah.
I didn't say it's balanced. Well, I guess muddling isn't going to be really much of an issue unless, I don't know, maybe the arugula, like you were heavily advocating that no one should really be grinding on the mint.
Yep, never on the mint. Never. Yeah, don't do that.
Hey there, I hope you're enjoying this episode so far. I want to break in again, and if you have ideas beyond the show, beyond the podcast, beyond this video content, if you have ideas for what Jewish drinking can bring you, whether it's, who knows, maybe it's Zoom sessions, maybe it's events, maybe, who knows, swag, please let me know. I'm very curious to hear from you any ideas, things that we can do, things that I can bring you from Jewish drinking. So feel free to reach out to me at drew@jewishdrinking.com. I'm happy to bring that to you. All right, now back into the show.
Egg whites, I think you're okay because so there's a couple things that on as it relates to cocktails is actually opposite of what traditionally is understood as good and bad. So for example, the peel an orange is considered bad, right? So you typically can't use something to remove it. Nonetheless, for cocktails, the peel of an orange is actually good, right? Because if you want if you want the oils, if you want to express the peel, you actually do want it. In fact, all over, I always find like citrus that I have the peels. I've only used it for a peel, and I end up taking out the peel, and then the fruit goes bad. So in that instance, what you have is essentially you've transformed what otherwise was psolas, right? Was bad,
rubbish,
right, into ochel and ochel. So ochel and ochel, you can separate it however you want to separate it. You can use a knife and a fork. You can do whatever you want. So therefore, you should be able to use a peeler in that instance So you remove, and remote shedding always holds that you can use a peeler on Shabbos. But even setting that aside, certainly over here,
why are you throwing that away? That's actually pretty big. That
So I think that it should be okay because you're going ahead and removing good from good, right? The orange is good and the peel is good.
Wait, quick question: why does Rev Moshe permit using a peeler on Shabbat?
I think because he'd use it as just a simple knife. Like it has anyways, so
it's not borer basically to cut the peel for twist.
Cut the peel from the thing, and then you could go ahead and express it.
Wow, and it's not schita.
Well, you're spraying it into food.
Oh, right, yeah.
Anyways, I don't even know if it would be because you can't really see it. I mean, it's hard for me to imagine because, and of course, when you so what we're talking about is when you for a number of drinks, the finish. It's not necessarily some fancy herb. It's simply you peel, an orange or a lemon, and you take the peel. And if you squeeze the peel, you'll actually see oils come out of it. And those oils are great because it's great that it's oil because, first of all, it sits on the top of the drink. Because it's oil, it doesn't, so it'll stay. So you'll get a little bit of that. Additionally, if you get it on the glass, I find it, although some people don't like it, on the stem. So this way, it's sort of on your finger, so you get the smell of it. So that's what we're talking about. So you would peel the orange or lemon, and then you would go ahead and express it. So normally it might be a problem, but here you're actually doing good from good. It's the same for egg white. Normally, it's understood that the egg white was bad for cocktails, although there are cocktails that use the yolk. Flips have yolks, and other cocktails have egg whites. And the reason they have egg whites is to create foam or structure to it. So you would essentially separate the white from the yolk, which is not a problem. You're using it straight in the cocktail. The alternative, just so you know, and this again creates an interesting problem because it flips what you normally would, is aquafaba, which is the chickpea liquid. So if you have a can of chickpeas, drain the chickpeas out because who wants those, and you keep the liquid. And the liquid, if you add it to a cocktail and shake it just like you would egg whites, it creates that same foam and structure in the cocktail. So I've this like raw eggs. So this is an alternative to using the raw eggs.
And you could strain that on Shabbat because it's ocho mitoch ocho.
Yeah, that's right.
It's interesting. Okay, right. That's a nice workaround. We're not trying to save the chickpeas from the rubbish of the liquid they're in. Exactly. We're trying to get both of them.
Both of them, exactly. I get both. Canned chickpeas. See?
Wow.
Now, the only problem, of course, then is Pesach, right? That actually brings up, I should mention Pesach only because it hit me. So a great workaround, another great workaround for grenadine. So never buy Rose's grenadine. That's disgusting. Generally make your own. It's very easy. You just require some amount of it's typically some amount of pomegranate juice. And if you have pomegranate molasses and then orange peels, look up a million recipes.
Really?
Make your own. Very easy. Highly recommend it.
Wow.
Very easy to make your own grenadine. But let's just say you don't have grenadine or whatever. So there's actually two, if you will, Jewish or Middle Eastern things that are terrific substitutes. One is date syrup. Silan. Now, the only thing you have to be careful is some of them are not just dates. Some of them also have sugar. So they affect the flavor. But you could pretty much, a lot of times, if it calls for a teaspoon of grenadine or something, you can certainly use Silan instead.
Oh, wow.
Very, very well. Great sort of flavor. It's a little bit a roasted flavor than you would necessarily get with the grenadine, but just in a pinch, it works great. And then pomegranate molasses. You can also do if you dilute it a little bit.
One question that came in today: someone asked, "Can you stir to mix if it will also hasten ice melting?" But
that's fine.
That's fine. Another one you want to talk about is coloring.
So coloring is it's actually interesting. You can go two ways here. It really depends on how you want to approach it. So typically the general rule is that there's no tzvia b'ochlen, that there's no coloring when it comes to food items.
Yeah.
However, there's some people that say that that's only when, if you will, as it's a byproduct, right? So so if it would be a problem with tzvia, you wouldn't be able to, for example, to pour red wine into water if you wanted to dilute it, right?
You're saying just for the color.
Right. So if you only did so some people hold that if you only did it for the color
and not for the flavor,
and not for the flavor at all, in other words, the sole purpose was for color, that might be problematic. But again, while there are all those opinions, so then it might be a problem when it comes to a cocktail, at least in some iteration. So most of the time when you're coloring, it's not obvious. In other words, you rarely have an ingredient, although there is one or two exceptions, where an ingredient is used solely for color. So you have it in terms of color separation. You have it with what the classic drink is, a New York sour, where you red wine
layer
on the top. So you do the red wine float on the top, and then it has a color on the bottom. I don't want to describe because I'm partially colorblind, so I don't want to get it wrong. But so that's when you have that. But that actually wouldn't be coloring the underlying liquid, right? In a way, it's separating, right? I mean, it's a terrific technique, right? So the density of the wine is different than the density of the cocktail. So if you pour it slow enough, the wine will sit on top. So you have this float. But one of the ways that you actually can color cocktails, it's a really, really cool way. It's called a pea flower, I want to say. And it's native to Southeast Asia. It's these little flowers, and they create this like very blue color. But the cool thing is that it then changes when it comes in contact with acid. So if you have a cocktail that has lime or lemon in it, and you add the pea berry or pea flower, it'll change from the color of the initial color into an entirely different color. Now that would be most of the time, used for coloring. Again, I would probably include it in a syrup, and then when it's a combination of the syrup and the other, sort of get it. But that would be the only issue if you took those opinions and you had a specific type of cocktail that you're using that sort of coloring for. But again, like the cocktail that I mentioned, the turmeric, which has a very, very bright yellow or orange color to it, that's totally okay.
One question, just back to the lemons. What was the workaround around that? Just because I didn't fully understand. Are we saying that when is it okay to squeeze lemons? When isn't it okay?
First, you have to decide if lemons are a problem at all. According to many opinions, there's no problem squeezing lemons into anything ever. You can go ahead and squeeze to your heart's content. Knock yourself out. Have a good time squeezing lemons. Then second, even if there is a problem with squeezing lemons, the way to have the workaround would be to squeeze not into an empty vessel, but onto or into something else, into some other fruit or onto some other fruit. And that would enable you to squeeze the lemon, right? Even if you held that it was generally prohibited, it's only prohibited into something empty.
Wait, so now I have a question, Dan. So you're saying, according to the regular, Shulchan Aruch said it's fine, but does that mean against the Mishnah Berurah you're allowed to squeeze into an empty vessel, or that's
what the Aruch HaShulchan holds, like, yeah.
Okay. I should have checked him out.
He holds that it's okay, so there's no problem at all with squeezing lemons, all bets off. And then to the extent that there would be, if you wanted to conform with the other opinion, so then, you could squeeze it into something.
Follow up on infusions. Let's say you wanted to infuse tequila with jalapenos. There's no issue with an infusion like that where you're not using any hot water or anything. Completely.
Yeah, that's totally fine. Yes, totally fine. And that's generally how I do it. It's a very quick infusion. You probably can't do it more than it's like 15, 20 minutes, I find, is about all you can do there before it becomes overwhelming. But yeah, that's just a simple infusion.
One more question on measuring.
No,
Let's say you have one of these small, I wouldn't call it a jigger, but small things that just say 1 ounce. It's usually the top of the shaker. So can I fill that up to not exactly that ounce line, but just short of the ounce line, and call that not exact measuring? Is that fine?
Seems that that's pretty much what they're advocating. I know it sounds kind of absurd, but I mean, that's what they say.
Thanks so much.
Absolutely.
To avoid all the issues, you could either pre-batch cocktails, right, before Shabbos, or it's essentially a pre-batch. It's just a punch. So if you're serving a group, actually, one of the easiest things to do, like for a kiddush, like a big kiddush or a shalom zachar, I'll do just a big punch or two. That's much easier, to do for large groups. It's great to serve, on Shabbos, especially if the punch has some carbonation, because you're at least having carbonation at the time, so it's still fresh. It also helps if it's carbonated, because the reason that cheaper products not like mine come in cans, cocktails, is because they're carbonated, and as a consequence, it's much easier to hide a lot of the flavors when you have something carbonated. So that's like one of the benefits. It livens things up that might otherwise not not be there. So the nice thing about a punch, especially if you have either sparkling wine or seltzer with it, there's a number of just great recipes, makes it very, very easy to do on Shabbos. Really, really easy to do.
Dan, this has been so fascinating, so insightful. And I will say, not just on the halachic perspective, but I think even for just best practices for not cocktail making, obviously Sunday through Friday, but also for Shabbat, especially. This was so fascinating. This is so interesting. This is so insightful. Is there anything that you would like to promote?
Drink good cocktails. And if you can't, if all else fails, you can always resort to buying DEKō cocktails and using those Shabbos morning.
Yes, those are definitely very handy. I mean, especially the spicy. We've been talking about spicy stuff, the jalapeno one.
The cucumber jalapeno, yeah.
Oh, so refreshing. All right, Dan, this is wonderful. Thank you so much. And l'chaim.
Chaim.
Okay.